Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. I'm Mark Porter. I'm the chairman of Christie's Americas and am especially proud to be a member of the board of the New York Botanical Garden. I'm delighted to see so many familiar faces in the room as we host the annual Andrew Carnegie Distinguished Lecture. Every autumn, the garden invites leaders in the fields of science, horticulture, landscape design, and conservation to present their work. Over the years, we've heard discussions that, while vastly differing in subject, always serve to inspire and educate. Tonight's presentation is no exception, and perhaps our most important discussion of recent years. I'd like to thank you all for attending this tonight and ask you to join me in welcoming the CEO and William C. Deere Sr., President of the New York Botanical Garden, someone I've enjoyed knowing for decades and have especially enjoyed collaborating with at the garden, Carrie Barrett. Please.
You do have to get in this little thing. Hi, I'm Carrie Barrett. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for your friendship, for your support of the garden. I've learned so many people who are interested in the culture of New York City, who've been in charge of it for such a long time, are not only interested lovers of art. Probably all of you stopped and looked at something on your way in today. What a fascinating show. But also great devoted gardeners, plants people who are very interested in our natural world. I'm delighted, as Mark said, to welcome you to our annual Andrew Carnegie Distinguished Lecture. I'd like to thank the Carnegie Corporation, and especially our very dear friend, Vartan Gregorian, who helps support this lecture every year. I want to thank all of you. This is a patrons lecture, a very special occasion where so many of you who support us by coming to the garden, helping us with all of our programs in science, horticulture, education, and coming here to listen to important topics. Tonight's especially important, and then to enjoy a glass of something with us so that we can continue our discussion afterwards. You understand that our work underscores the importance of plants. Maybe that seems obvious, but plants, the way that we're thinking of them, especially this fall, but all the time, are more and more important. Maybe the narrative is important to life on this planet, important to life on Earth. And when I saw this summer little kids in the Edible Academy making pizza out of vegetables that they had picked that day, and I swear to God, things that they would have never eaten at home. You know, there was no cheese. Kids were picking peppers and roasting garlic and doing all kinds of things. I know that is not only a delicious amount of fun and a really, really good lunch, but those are children who will have better lives. They'll probably sleep better, they'll go home and they'll talk about what they did during the day. The exponential value of having people that actually care about plants is so important. And tonight's topic is very topical and key, and in just a moment I'm going to introduce Dr. Thomas Lovejoy and Dr. Robert Watson. We're very, very delighted to have both of you here tonight, distinguished scientists. And let me tell you just very briefly, though, about our summer at the New York Botanical Garden. We had a magnificent exhibition, first ever takeover of the Great South Lawn in front of the conservatory. We would only allow such a great feature of the Botanical Garden to be taken over by a master, and it was Roberto Burle Marx, through the agency of Todd Forrest, his horticulture team, and the great landscape designer Raymond Jungels. Who knew? We knew that we were doing something that would be beautiful, tropical, attractive, something that only we could do, that would be popular. We knew that we would play wonderful music and have great programs that celebrated Brazil. But who knew that in the last 2 weeks of that exhibition, the reports would come online and in papers everywhere that the Amazon was burning in ways that more significantly than it ever had before. Always burns in August, always gets hot and dry, but never like this. And I was so proud to be in a team, some of whom came back from August vacations, to say, what can we do? We work down there. And our Dr. Doug Daly is here with us tonight, who's just back, like this morning. Yeah, from Rondonia, a project that he's been working on for a while, for over a decade, and where he will return, but in the moment said, I'll go now. I'll go now. And so he's just back from 10 days, and I encourage all of you to look at our website and our blog. We sent our staff photographer down who said he was over the moon to be able to go and to document species identification, found a new species, right? It's very, very exciting. Found a new species, taught tree stewardship, brought those species back. We'll have them in the herbarium in no time. And really, you know, within about 10 days was able to tell a story about the work that we do that a lot of people don't know about. This is all very, very important. We were proud to be part of the topic of tonight, really active during Climate Week. By doing, I can tell all of you as friends, pretty much what we always did already. We didn't develop militant or activist programs. We had a free day. We invited people to come in for programs. We had lectures. We had Bill McKibben speak about falter and climate change, and lots of people came to hear that. And then they went out to our farmers market and ate organic vegetables and had a beautiful day. So we're trying to make that balance between how do we mitigate climate change. At the New York Botanical Garden, we enjoy nature, and we really think seriously about the ways that we live. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our two speakers tonight. Dr. Robert Watson will give us a brief presentation and then be followed by our presentation and then be followed in conversation with Tom Lovejoy, our great friend. Dr. Watson has held top scientific advisory positions at the World Bank, in the White House, and in the United Nations, numerous national and international awards for contributions to science. And since 2016, he has shared the very significant United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This was an extraordinary effort to integrate vast and disparate troves of biological data in scope and complexity. It surpasses even the work of the UN's Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Its findings and implications for humanity and our planet are shocking and upsetting, and there's no better person to share this information with you than our guest tonight, who I'm sure has dire, shocking, and upsetting news, but it was also very cheerful a little while ago. So what I also like about our work, and I follow Tom Lovejoy, who did introduce the term biological diversity, who met me for a cup of tea a little bit earlier this afternoon and always has something hopeful to say about where we're going. We love having you as our board member. The work that you're doing in Washington and the world is so significant. And in the world of travelers, you just were in Costa Rica yesterday, right? So I just really appreciate all the work that everyone's doing in the world and that we can call this part of the work of the New York Botanical Garden. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Sir Robert Watson.
Well, first let me say it's a real pleasure to be invited to give this Carnegie lecture. And much of my story might well be negative, so if Tom's going to be positive, that would be great. But my message is that we are in trouble, but we can deal with it if with a little bit of political will. So, what do we know? It's unequivocal that we humans are changing the Earth's climate. We're losing biodiversity, we're degrading our land, and we're polluting our oceans. And all this threatens human well-being for the current and future generations. Why am I so sure? We have these international assessments, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I chaired a decade ago, and the IPBES, which you've just heard about, which I've just finished chairing. These are credible, open, transparent, and legitimate processes. They're transdisciplinary. That means we get the governments together with the scientific community, with the private sector, and with the NGOs. The scientists are natural scientists, social scientists, the humanities, technologies, lawyers, business people, and indigenous and local knowledge from indigenous people. We make sure that when we bring these scientists together, and it's normally many hundreds for each one of our reports. We make sure it's gender balanced and geographically balanced, as well as intellectually balanced. And the crucial thing is we have all of the key players, stakeholders, involved in one way or another in these assessments. We make sure they're credible by doing peer review. That is, say, we do a draft document, then we send it to experts to review, we revise it, we send it to experts the second time, and we revise it again. We explicitly say to governments and the private sector and civil society, what do we know really well, but what's still fairly uncertain, so people can understand our level of confidence. We try and be highly policy relevant, but we are not prescriptive. We don't tell governments what they should do, and I'll come to that later. Nature totally underpins all of human life, all of human well-being. In fact, we are part of nature. We are producing more food today than we ever did before, more energy, more fiber, and this is good, but it's come at a major cost. We are destroying biodiversity and degrading ecosystems. Nature helps to control the climate system. It helps to control pollution, floods. It helps to pollination services. It helps in many, many what we call regulating ways. And it's also incredibly important from a social, spiritual point of view. Our identities are part of nature. Hopefully you can see some of this, but if not, what I'm saying here is, if you see a downward arrow, it means things are getting bad. If you see an upward arrow, things are getting good. As you can see, nearly all of the arrows go down. So effectively, and even on food, we are producing more terrestrial food, that is on agriculture, but we are destroying fisheries in the open ocean. We're compensating a little bit by aquaculture, but even the food system is a mixed system at the moment. Terrestrial agriculture is going up, but open ocean fishing is going down. But the basic message is, by producing the food, the energy, and the fiber that we all need for our well-being, we are destroying much of nature. 75% of the land, ice-free land, has already been converted. And by 2050, 90% of the land. In other words, we've converted our forests, we've converted our grasslands, we've converted our mangrove swamps, normally into agriculture or into roads and cities. Land degradation today affects 3.2 billion people adversely. That's almost half the world's population. 66% of the ocean is in bad shape, one way or another, and only 3% of the world's ocean is still pure. We've lost more than 85% of all other wetland systems, and they play a critical role in purifying our water. We've already lost 34% of global biodiversity, and by 2050, it will increase to something like 38 to 46%. This comes from the IUCN, and they look, and without the details, they look to see how many species are threatened. Are they vulnerable? Are they critically endangered? Are they endangered? And so there are lots of species. The basic message is, if something's in yellow, orange, or red, let alone black, which means extinct, it's in bad shape. We used all of this work, and we came to a conclusion that there are probably about 8 million species on Earth. 1 million out of 8 are threatened with extinction. That's an incredible figure. It's not inevitable. We can save most of that 1 million, but if we carry on in the way we are today, what I call business as usual, 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And the rate of extinction is at least tens to hundreds of times the natural rate of evolution. We humans are changing nature at a considerable rate. And this just shows you some of them. As you can see, this was the percentage of different species from 1500 till now. And you can see that in amphibians, we've potentially already lost 2.5% of them. Mammals, about 2%. Birds, 1.6%. Fishes, probably less than 1%. But and you can see, it's the direction of change. It's going up at a tremendous rate. It's not just wild species. Many domesticated species have now been lost in just the way we've actually performed our agriculture and performed our livestock management. The drivers of change are changing in a totally unprecedented way. What are these direct drivers? Land use change and conversion, as I've already said, forests to agriculture, over-exploitation, especially in the oceans. We've overfished the oceans. Climate change, and I'll come back to that, is the third most important, and then pollution and invasive alien species. But what drives that? Demographic, social-cultural. The more people you have and the wealthier they become, they consume more. So it's not just population increase. We in North America and in Europe consume far more than any African, any Indian or Chinese. So it's not just total number of people. So you can't just blame China or India. It's also the way we consume. Economic factors, our subsidies, and I'll come back to that. Our whole economic system is driving unsustainable practices. Our institutions and our governance structures are really in bad shape, both nationally and internationally. And climate change and loss of biodiversity is leading to conflicts in certain parts of the world. While climate change has not been the dominant driver of biodiversity loss today, it is projected to become as or more important than all of the other drivers, land use change, overexploitation. In Paris a couple of years ago, every government in the world agreed to try and limit human-induced climate change to no more than 2 degrees Celsius and hopefully limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I come back to that. But the key point is we need to meet those climate agreements. So the obvious question is, how well are we doing? I'm actually going to miss these two because the next one gives you the actual, there's no point getting into that detail actually. Where are we? Every country in the world that signed the Paris Agreement and has ratified it should be applauded. They all agreed to limit human-induced climate change to 1.5 or 2. Unfortunately, the current pledges will not put us on a pathway to 1.5 or 2. The current pathway is to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. We've already changed 1, and if we don't have stronger pledges, we're going to see a 3 or a 4 degree warmer world. The land area will warm more than the oceans, and the high latitudes will warm more than the equatorial region. I just came back from a ministerial meeting in Sweden, the Arctic Forum. The Arctic area warms more than twice the global average. And hence, if we ever do see a 3 or 4 degree world, the Arctic will be 8 to 10 degrees warmer and will be very different. The so-called targets of 1.5 and 2, we will pass the 1.5 target unless we do something very different very soon, probably in the 2030s. And we'll pass the 2 degree target by 2050, 2070. We have a problem. We are not dealing with climate change in a serious way. One important, very, very important finding was the incredible contribution of Indigenous people and local community. One, they've got incredible knowledge of how to manage biodiversity and their local ecosystems. And two, they live in some of the most important land we need to save in different parts of the world. They actually occupy 25% of global land, 35 highly conserved ecosystems, 35% of the protected areas. They manage agrobiodiversity extremely well. So while nature is declining less rapidly on their land, it is still declining because we're putting pressure by our agricultural practices, our roads, on the land Indigenous and local people occupy. And therefore, they are under increasing pressure. And until recently, I would argue, they've had little voice in the political debate. Their voice has got much louder in the last 5 to 10 years. And finally, in the assessments, the sort of things I've chaired, we fully embrace and involve Indigenous knowledge. So there are things called the Aichi targets. Forget the name Aichi, it's just where they were done in Japan. We have 20 targets that literally every government in the world agreed to try and save biodiversity. And then there's also 17 what we call sustainable development goals. No more hunger, no more poverty, clean water for everybody, gender equality, sustainable production and consumption. And these two things in some ways go together. So when we did our biodiversity assessment, this IPBES, we looked at these so-called Aichi targets. And the only thing to take away from this, without looking at all of the detail, is we have 20 targets. How well are we doing? Well, nearly all of it's red, that's poor. We got a few yellows, we're doing moderately well. And we got a couple of greens and a few we actually don't know. In other words, even though the governments in 2010 said they would protect biodiversity, they would conserve biodiversity, and there would be equitable share in the benefits, and they would bring policies and technologies to bear, the general picture at the moment is poor. There has been some progress, don't let me be too negative, but not enough to meet the targets that the government's agreed on. But when we think of climate change and biodiversity, we think of them as environmental issues. They are, but there's so much more. They're development issues. They both impact on poverty alleviation, food and water security, and human health. They're economic issues. When you change the Earth's climate, it comes at economic cost. And biodiversity and nature have incredible natural value. They have both economic value and social value. So we have to recognize that development issues and their economic issues, but they're also security issues, because as you degrade the environment, especially in developing countries, it's led to local conflict. Poor people depend on our natural ecosystems, and as these natural ecosystems get destroyed, it leads to local conflict and migration. And it's an equity and ethical issue. It's industrialized countries that have largely caused the problem, certainly of climate change, and a lot of the biodiversity, because we import goods from Brazil, from Africa. So we Americans and Europeans, we have a footprint in Africa, we have a footprint in Latin America and Asia. So we've largely caused the problems, but it's poor people and developing countries that suffer the most, basically. And the other issue is, have we got the right, this current generation, to leave a devastated world to our children and grandchildren? And it's a real moral issue. We humans have no right to destroy nature. And these issues are, as I've already explicitly and implicitly said, they're inter and intra-generation. This current generation is already seeing the effects of biodiversity loss and changes in climate. Future generations will see it even more. And as I said, we have these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's about 17. So we assessed the question, to what degree is nature helping reach these goals, or is it undermining it? And again, you don't have to look at the details. The first column is poor or declining support of biodiversity to support these UN goals, like no poverty, zero hunger, good health, clean water, sustainable cities. All negative. The first column, arrows going down. Second says a little bit of partial support, but not as enough that's needed. And as you can see, there are a few yellow arrows. But in general, as we are destroying biodiversity, as we're changing climate, we are undermining literally all of the UN Sustainable Development. And the overall goal is leave nobody behind. Make sure everyone has clean water, adequate food, a healthy life. We're actually causing more and more inequity in the world today. Again, you can't see this, but there's a simple message here. To what degree does land degradation matter? And at the very top, the first 3 or 4 bars says, land degradation is critical of undermining poverty alleviation, food security, water security. We have to deal with land degradation if we have any hope of reaching any of these targets. So we said, look, we know we're in bad shape today, and we know why we're in bad shape today. What about the next 50 years? So we have plausible futures. We imagine the world and how it can evolve in the next 50 years. We have economic optimism, rapid technology development, high demand for goods and services, high economic growth, and low population. Global sustainability, we actually care about a sustainable world. We have environmental awareness, we have low energy demand, we have low population, and we still have medium to high economic growth. We have regional competition where every region of the world fights each other, and basically there's barriers to trade, high population, slow economic growth, and then inequality, slow economic growth, high population, etc. So we looked at all four. So I think, well, at least the global sustainability, we're going to be in good shape. Oh dear. The answer is none of those scenarios put us in good shape. If we look at biodiversity, local species richness, regional species richness, or a thing called biodiversity intactness, they're all negative. They're less negative in global sustainability, but they are still negative. Why? In every scenario, we still have climate changing. And there's still, in most of these, some degree of land use change all the way to 2050. No one is optimistic. We can't fully stop further loss of forests, further loss of grassland, and we certainly aren't going to stop climate change in the next few days, for the next few years. So clearly there are, however, again, this is actually looking at some of these ecological services, soil protection, crop pollination, etc. All of those go down, but we are going to produce more timber, we are going to produce more food, and we are going to produce more bioenergy. So we really have to think, what world do we want? And actually, we're going to have some pretty severe changes in the way we, the human race, behave if we are going to save the future. So what are the options for the future that we all want? Now, all of us in the room probably have a different vision of what we want. Someone in Africa that's struggling for food today and clean water, probably their aspirations are much less than many of us. People in other parts of the world, different again. But generally, we want a sustainable world where everyone is more equal than they are today. Therefore, we need rapid implementation of the instruments that we already have. We have lots of policies that we can do. We have lots of technologies. We have lots of practices. We're just not using them. But we will need some very bold decision for large-scale transformative change. As I say, we have the knowledge we need, or much of it, not all of it. We have many of the tools, but we have to do better deployment. And there are lots of different examples, and I'll flick through a couple in a minute. There are some very successful examples in different parts of the world, but we need to scale them up and we need to expand them. Let me miss that one. That's hard to describe in a few short minutes. So, what are the challenges related to climate change? Well, we also need a good quality of life. We need to deal with climate and biodiversity together. You cannot separate these out anymore. And therefore, as we deal with climate change, as we deal with biodiversity, we have to recognize there are some synergistic effects, that is good effects, they play together, but there's also trade-offs. If we do reforestation, put back native vegetation where it was once, the same trees we largely cut down, and if we restore these areas, that's a positive for climate and biodiversity. But if we go to large-scale afforestation, putting trees where they weren't before on a very large scale, or we go to bioenergy, a monoculture, a grass or a hybrid tree, and we put it where we've got some native vegetation, forests or grasslands, it will absolutely lead to further destruction of biodiversity. And if we try and put the bioenergy crops on arable land, we will undermine food and water security. And to be honest, most of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, most of the big climate models, their way to try and realize a 1.5 or a 2-degree world that I talked about earlier, totally depend on very large-scale bioenergy. And so we have a real challenge of when we deal with climate, we must think of the consequences, the unintended consequences, potentially for biodiversity. So what do we need? We need much better governance, and I'll come back to that in a second. Much better governance. We need our economic systems to evolve, and I'll mention that as well. We need a more equitable world, and we have to think about equity in all of our decisions. We need cross-sectoral planning. We can't think, when you're in a Ministry of Energy or Agriculture or Water or Treasury or the Foreign Minister, they have to work together. These issues of climate change and biodiversity cut across all government sectors. They cut across all UN agencies, and they cut across nearly all of the private sector. So we need cross-sectoral planning. We need incentives for sustainable production and consumption. And we have to think, what is the right social narrative? What's the right value system? Is it owning 2 cars, 3 cars, a bigger and bigger house, more and more vacations? What is a good quality of life? What is that narrative? And that is something that we need to think about. So cross-sectoral, I've really said it. We need to think very carefully how we produce our food. What do we mean by sustainable fisheries? When we do land-based climate change mitigations, I said for things like bioenergy, must think about biodiversity. And therefore, nature-based solutions in cities also very important. Some work we did in biodiversity and in climate change. Nature is the foundation of even a good city. A small river that flows through the city, green parks. People love to get mental relaxation. You've been working hard all morning, and if you've got a nice sunny lunchtime, go and sit in the local park, sit by a river. It really is mentally relaxing. You can't put an economic value on it, but my God, the social value of that is immense, basically. So green, blue cities, absolutely essential. So yeah, what do we have to do? Well, first, biodiversity is valuable. It's natural capital. We need to take it into account in our national accounting systems, and it rarely is. We need to recognize not only the market value of biodiversity, but the non-market, the value for controlling climate, pollution, floods, etc., and the social value. All must be considered in decision-making of governments, private sector, and individuals, actually. We need to eliminate the harmful agricultural, energy and transportation. Over $1 trillion a year go into these subsidies. They all adversely affect climate change and biodiversity, and they rarely help the poor. All the World Bank studies show the middleman does well. The poor rarely benefit, basically. We need incentives for sustainable production and consumption, and we need to internalize the externalities into our system. I'm not going to go through any of this, but we've got some very successful eco-certification programs in Latin America, the Rainforest Alliance on the forest, some very sustainable coffee production. We've got some really good transboundary conservation projects in Asia and Pacific. We've got some really good restoration projects in Europe and Central Asia. Now, we've also got eco-certification in other parts of the world, transboundary in other parts of the world, restoration in other. I just simply wanted to list just a couple. We've getting success. Protected areas, not only in Africa, but in Latin America, Asia, and in Europe and North America. And we've had some really successful land degradation and restoration projects. So we have got some successful projects. These are the ones that we now need to scale up and really go in a very large scale. So we need to learn, why do some work and why do some fail, and which ones are replicable. We have seen a reduction in the net loss of forests in many parts of the world. So we're doing at least progress in some forests of the world. Clearly, as I've said, many of the practices of indigenous and local people, we've got to sort of learn. They may not all be replicable, some are basically, and we've slowed down the conversion of grasslands. So why are we failing to act? To address these issues, we need, as I say, concerted and coordinated action by governments, the private sector, and civil society at all levels, local, national, regional, and global. Well, these are my personal views. We're not quite so candid in the assessment that I shared, to be quite candid. It's my interpretation. Absolutely no trust between and among governments, even developed governments to developed governments. You know, does Europe trust America? Does America trust Europe? Limited trust between developed and developing countries. Other developed countries still try to limit our development in developing countries, and that's often said. To what degree do the NGOs trust the private sector? And to what degree do governments trust the private sector? So there's an issue of trust. Vested interests and power asymmetries and corruption in both governments and the private sector. Many love the status quo. They love the cheap energy, cheap food, perverse subsidies, and they love relying on GDP as a measure of economic growth. It does measure economic growth, but not sustainable economic growth. Most people think short term. On these issues, we need to think short, medium, and long term. These are issues for decades to come. We're not going to solve them overnight. We have to think, where do we want to be in 2030, 2040, and 2050, and put the policies together and technologies and practices over that time span. But governments and the private sector often have a short time horizon. The north-south divide. Industrialized countries have caused the problems. Developing countries and poor people in developing countries are the most effective. Therefore, where does responsibility lie? What's the responsibility of a developing country versus an industrialized country? We don't, as I've always said, have inclusive governance structures, so many voices are not heard. We haven't got the financial resources that we've promised to help developing countries in both climate change and loss of biodiversity. And we can't just throw money at developing countries. Many smaller developing countries, we need to build the capacity to absorb the money. China could absorb as much money as we throw it. So can India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa. But many, many African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries, we have to build capacity first, but it needs money and it needs technology. And the trouble is, once we do agree on these conventions, and we have conventions on climate, biodiversity, land degradation, and wetlands, they have no effective compliance measures. You can't force a country to do something. No one can force America what to do. We can't force China what to do. Maybe if you're a very small country dependent on foreign aid, they can be coerced, but that's not the way to do it. They need to own a policy. They need to own a final goal, basically. And as I've already said, we undermine. Why did I put this up? And I apologize, it's a bit out. I went to a very intriguing conference on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at the Oxford Debating Society. It's called and it was Organizing Society for the 21st Century, the Future of Democracy, a New Social Contract in the Age of Cognitive Machines. Some really interesting issues. What is truth? What is democracy? What is the future of capitalism? What's the role of artificial intelligence? What's the balance of the two faces of a modern society? Democratically elected people, but the power of the private sector. What's the role of ethics and religion? The future of the political system? And the question was, is democracy right for the 21st century? Absolutely intriguing. All questions that are relevant, that we need answers. We didn't come up with an answer, of course. That was much too much. I mean, give us a couple more days and we would have done. The voice for the planet. As I've already said, these are inter and intergenerational equity. The poor, big issue. The youth are finally speaking out. They don't vote. In fact, some of them aren't eligible to vote. But you've all seen, pushed by Greta and others, really a loud voice of we are not protecting future generations. And so you've heard all of the ones on climate change led by the school walkouts. But a very important one was Voice for the Planet, launched at the World Economic Forum by Sir David Attenborough on behalf of young people. And that was a new deal for nature and people in 2020. Really key. The question I actually have is, are the politicians really listening to the voice of the young? And will they really do anything differently? And it is a question I have with a really big question mark, or is it lip service? So in conclusion, the trends, loss of species, degradation of ecosystems, loss of genetic variability is worrying. And business as usual is not viable. The call for action, transformational change, big change. What do we mean about transformational change? If you go to Wikipedia, transformational changes, we need to change the way we change. Everything's connected to everything, and we need to recognize all of these connections. It sounds impossible, but it's not. It actually is quite doable, basically. We need to directly look at the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity. We must look at climate change and loss of biodiversity together. We've got to scale up the projects that work and the policies that work, as I've said. We've got to coordinate across the sectors. We've got to evolve not only the economic system, but the financial system as well. And I've said that already. And we need inclusive governance. Can we do it? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. Is there the political will? I'm an optimist, but it's not quite there. But in the last few years, the direction is looking better and better. The governments now, all the way from environment ministers to foreign ministers, some finance ministers and heads of state, are seriously talking about business as usual is not an option. We have to get serious. Thank you.
So while Bob was at his conference, I was at a conference in Costa Rica. And we had a whole session yesterday about nature-based solutions. But it got really interesting at the end because we sort of broke away from the agenda when somebody said, you know, for 1% of the gross economic product of the world, we could solve all these. So literally 1%. So I'm just throwing that out there for everybody, but you had a great response to that when I mentioned it to you earlier. That was a great response.
Yeah, the point is, if I had to do one thing, if I could only do one thing, and I was, you know, king of the world, I would get rid of these perverse agricultural subsidies, energy subsidies, transportation. So I always thought the number was about $1 trillion a year. At the meeting in Oxford, someone gave a number of $5 trillion a year. If we could convert those subsidies into incentives for sustainable production and for conserving biodiversity, addressing climate change, we could solve the problem.
And that's where democracy comes in because we actually pay for those subsidies, right? Back in 1992, at the Earth Summit, there were 3 environmental conventions that came into existence. Climate change, which Bob has spent a lot of time working with, one on desertification. The third was the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as you will have picked up, these conventions have their own calendars and rhythms, and like every couple of years, depending on the convention, there will be a conference of the parties, right? And that's where they set targets like the ones that were set in Japan. So the next one for biodiversity is going to be in China towards the end of 2020. And I just wonder what your assessment is of where that's headed, whether there will be meaningful targets that come out of that.
There's 2 large international meetings next year, which will at least be at the ministerial level and hopefully even at the heads of state level, One is indeed in China to look at where do we go on biodiversity? What actions do we need? What should our vision be for biodiversity? But there's one then later, about a month later, on climate change, looking at the Paris Agreement and saying to what degree is the Paris Agreement that viable, or do we need to strengthen, as I've suggested, the pledges to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What comes to mind is that in 2000, the governments of the world said, we want to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2010. Well, didn't come close to it. They then brought these sort of 20 Aichi targets into account. And as I've shown, we're failing to meet most of them. And yet when I've talked recently to a few ministers, they've said, we need to be really ambitious in China. We need really ambitious targets. And I agree. But my question to them, how can they be ambitious when they're not even meeting the current targets, basically? And so the question, and it was a phrase used by the Deputy Environment Minister in England at the G7 summit in Metz, France, earlier this year, Environment Ministers meet, and she said, targets without actions are meaningless. And so what I would hope would come out of China would be, yes, some true targets, and I personally like some of the current ones, so I would not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I do think governments have got to say national pledges of where they're going to go, not just global pledges, and say how are they going to get there. So I would hope there would be some discussion, not only of where we want to go, but how we will get there.
So you're referring to the targets that were set in, what was it, 2010? And which there is demonstrable falling short. Let's just put it nicely that way. So my question is, since this assessment that you just gave us such a great summary of was the very first time there was a United Nations assessment on biological diversity, if that had come earlier, do you think there would have been a different bit of progress?
I honestly don't know. And the reason I say that is the parallel is the climate system. And they had their first true international assessment that was within a UN structure. It started in 1988. And they've had 6 large international assessments since then. I chaired the 3rd one from 1997 to the year 2002. And so we've had international assessments on climate change, really, while we've got more and better science since 1988, they've all largely said the same thing. We humans are just changing the Earth's climate, and most of the consequences are adverse for human well-being. So we've had those since 1988. Now, we had before the IPBES, which I reported on, we did have a global assessment called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but it was non-governmental. I was the board co-chair, not the science co-chair of that. And it said many of the same things we said today in our last report. So what the difference is, and you're right, it might have made a difference, governments were involved. To me, what's crucial in any assessment now, all relevant stakeholders need to be involved in the process. Well, who are relevant? Governments, they make policy. Private sector, they control the economic system. NGOs play a critical role. Individuals can play a critical role. And the most important thing you can do is vote for a politician that cares about these things, by the way. And I'm serious about that as well. And so we need, and individuals, we need everybody, and the media, absolutely crucial. And of course, social media has changed everything, but the media play a crucial role to get information out to people. So to be honest, having governments involved by making it an intergovernmental process, I think we captured the governments in the process more than the non-governmental processes we had before. But there is one correction. IPCC is part of the UN, IPBES is not. We made sure it was intergovernmental, but independent of the UN system, which can get a little bureaucratic.
So we haven't talked a lot here about how important the private sector is in driving what are largely negative trends. And the flip side, the potential that private sector might have to actually help things, drive things in a better direction. What is your take on that?
Oh, I think working with the private sector is absolutely critical. It's as critical to work with the private sector, in my opinion, as with the governments, basically. And the reason is the private sector actually relies on nature. They rely on clean water. If you're a power company or an aluminum smelting company, you need clean water to cool down the power plant, nuclear or fossil fuel. Agriculture, by definition, the foundation of a good, successful agricultural system, are good soils and clean water to grow things, basically. So, and if you go across literally, not every, but most private sector, they rely to some degree or not on nature. The other side of the flip coin, they have a footprint on nature, and we want to work with them to find ways to reduce that footprint on nature. Also, I think we're seeing a society that is becoming more and more socially and environmentally aware, and the private sector needs to respond to the consumer who wants sustainable production, basically. So my view is it's critically important. And the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, that now has over 200 companies involved from all parts of the world, and the World Economic Forum that brings together the heads of private sector and governments and scientific and the society in Davos every year at the end of January. They're both starting to take these issues really quite seriously. And so I'm actually hoping that when you look at a good private sector company, and I'll pick one, an agricultural one, Unilever, they really care about sustainable fisheries. They really care about sustainable production. And so I'm hoping that the private sector can show that you can make a profit and be sustainable. And I think private sector learning from other private sector, they're probably going to listen to them far more than listening to me. Well, in fact, I'm sure of that.
So there's a really interesting piece of this puzzle, which is the extent of public awareness. And here we are in New York City, and every day millions of people turn on the tap and they don't have a clue that the water comes from the Catskill watershed. In fact, I have this fantasy that in every New York subway car there will be a little poster up there with the other ads that says, "Have you thanked the New York City watershed today?" So what do you think might be some of the best ways to enhance public awareness?
Well, I mean, the last 10 or 20 years has revolutionized communication. I mean, when we started IPCC, let alone IPBES, the only way you could get things out, you had to go to television stations, radio stations, and the print media. And they did a pretty good job to get the message out. Now, with social media, it really has leveled the playing field. Anybody can get information within minutes. It means people have access to information. It means that by using the information, they can participate in the democratic process far more, because they've got information, they can hopefully understand the issues. But social media can be good or bad. It can be used just as well to get appropriate, correct information out as fake news. And a lot of people that use social media tend to follow one or more people. You see, so-and-so's got 1 million hits. They've got 1 million followers. That's great if that person is someone that actually cares about these issues and is actually getting the right messages out to their followers. But it can equally be used, as one fairly powerful person in Washington, D.C., to use social media to distort democracy, in my opinion. So social media has incredible power for good and bad. But it does mean, so actually, when we put out the IPBES report, two interesting statistics, we had over 8,000, nearly 9,000 now, online media stories, really substantive ones, really substantive. And I didn't realize, I got it sent to me 3 days ago, I've been quoted in 7,800 media articles since the beginning of this year. Now, hopefully that wasn't fake news, obviously, that I was reliable.
So, of course, in all of this, the kind of science and the kind of public outreach the New York Botanical Garden has and continues to be engaged in and is growing all the time is an essential part of it. But to keep this evening program to a sustainable length, let me ask just one final question, which is, what is your assessment of the role of youthful voices in getting a more sustainable future?
I mean, it obviously must be a positive. I mean, by definition, we actually need the youth of today to actually bring these issues to the attention of their parents and to government and to the private sector. Absolutely crucial. I'm hoping that the youth movements will be lasting and will have real impact. I think time will tell. I'd like to see the same question in 2 years' time of, have the youth movements really had an impact on decision-making of governments and of the private sector? The last comment I would like to make is botanical gardens and the research communities are absolutely essential. All of this stuff, the view is very simple. Science, and I mean natural, social sciences, the humanities, economic, science with a big S, is critical for informed, evidence-based policy formulation. So the work of the academic community, the work of the intellectual think tanks, the work of the botanical gardens is absolutely critical to providing the evidence that governments and the private sector need, and for us as individuals, of how can we as individuals have more sustainable livelihoods. But it's crucial that this knowledge informs the way we behave, informs the policies that are put in place for the future and future generations.
And the root word for science is the word to know.
Yep.
Thank you, Bob.
Sure.